Hey everyone, I'm Bram, and I'm ashamed to say that I've recently fallen back into playing Fallout Shelter.
Fallout Shelter is a free-to-play spin-off from the Fallout series, developed by Behavior Interactive and Bethesda Game Studios. It's not really a good game, but it's also not offensively bad. At its core, it's a pretty basic building and resource management style game a la Tiny Tower, with the aesthetic elements of Fallout sprinkled on top. The core gameplay loop is more addictive than it is engaging, but it's a fine enough distraction for when I'm on the toilet or keeping my hands busy while watching TV. The game revolves around managing a nuclear vault, building its rooms, making sure there's enough resources to keep everyone alive, and keeping the vault dwellers happy. All the dwellers have specific traits that make them more suitable for certain tasks, so the higher these traits are, the better they'll be able to pull their weight. You can get new dwellers in two ways. The first is to wait for people to arrive at your doorstep and invite them in. While this works perfectly fine, there is no way of ensuring that these people are actually any good at the things you need them to be good at. The second way is to put a male and a female vault dweller together in a living quarters, wait for them to chat each other up for a bit, and eventually they'll run towards the bedrooms and make a baby. The baby's traits are determined by those of their parents, so in this way you can select the right dwellers in order to produce a child that will be helpful to your specific needs. And wait. I'm selecting people for procreation to maximize certain characteristics in their children that I have deemed desirable. Yeah, that's eugenics? This game encouraged me to do a eugenics. For those who aren't in the loop about racist 19th century pseudoscience, or a worrying amount of political discourse in 2021, eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices based on the idea that human populations can and should be improved by selective breeding, including those in the process who have been judged to possess positive qualities and excluding those who are deemed to possess negative qualities. While this is not synonymous with white supremacy or quote-unquote scientific racism, you can probably see quite clearly how the two are very compatible. And eugenicist theories have been invoked multiple times throughout history to justify the forced sterilizations or outright killings of people of color, disabled people, and people with gender identities or sexual orientations that fall outside the societal norm. This makes it clear why eugenics is junk science. You cannot breed based on merit because merit doesn't exist in the natural world. Merit only exists as something defined by a person, and I hope I don't have to explain why it's a bad idea to restrict people's rights to have children based on someone's arbitrary idea of what humanity should be. On top of that, it assumes that all these positive traits come from genetics, even though they are very often shaped by environment and education to a very high degree. Even if you don't agree that eugenics is bad in theory, which you should, it also just doesn't work. And yet, that's exactly what Fallout Shelter incentivizes you to do. Now, I'm not saying that someone at Bethesda intentionally put this in the game because they were such a fan of eugenics. I think it's more of a case of not thinking through the implications of a game's systems and mechanics and how they will interact with each other. Dan Olsen made a similar point about how Minecraft systems incentivize you to commit some pretty heinous acts mirroring the history of colonialism, similarly stressing how this was unintentional. Probably. At its core, Fallout Shelter has the same problem that all Bethesda-developed Fallout games have, being that it mostly just throws recognizable elements from better Fallout games together without much thought. In this case, they wanted to have some form of the special system in the game, so they made dwellers that possess these 7 attributes to a lesser or larger degree, and made those attributes determine what they were good at. Then they decided that dwellers should be able to have kids, and that kids inheriting their parents' traits made sense. Then they decided that it would be inconvenient for the player if dwellers could just have a kid at any moment, so they decided that dwellers could only have children when the player puts them together in a living quarters, and whoops, they made a system that incentivizes eugenics. It's also quite possible that they intended to have you breed the most desirable human beings for your vault through genetic selection, and just didn't think about how icky that is. That may seem unlikely until you realize we're talking about Bethesda. If you're unfamiliar with Fallout Shelter, you may think, hey, weren't there a bunch of vaults in the Fallout series that were used for horrific experiments? Maybe that's why the eugenics mechanics are there. And I'm glad you said that, Strawman, because I disagree with that reading for 2 reasons. 1, it would imply that any critical thought was put into this game, and 2, it is the explicit goal of the player to keep the vault dwellers as happy as possible in the game, and no indication is ever giving that this is some sort of experiment. I would also disagree that would make it okay, because responsibly portraying bad things in a game is something quite different from actually having the player participate in those bad things, never commenting on why those things are bad, and never having the player suffer any adverse consequences because they did those bad things. Also, eugenics are shown to actually work and produce the desired results in the game, which they do not do in real life. Eugenics is a junk science, but in this game,
All of this just works. It's not, I'm not kidding.
that by itself has some worrying implications. You're providing a pro-eugenics argument that is not true in real life, thereby making it seem, to some people, a bit more reasonable than it actually is. I saw something similar in Remedy's Control, where you can find logs of someone's torture and questioning by the Federal Bureau of Control. While this is not exactly portrayed as ethical, it does eventually lead to the subject giving up the information, thereby communicating that torture may not be pretty, but that it is effective. This mirrors the real-world justifications for inhumane torture given by US government agencies, by perpetuating the false idea that torture leads to reliable information, which in real life it almost never does. So, Fallout Shelter unintentionally advocates for eugenics. What now? The aim of this video is not to get anyone to boycott this game or to turn the public against Bethesda specifically. They're doing a pretty good job of that themselves. All I want to do here is stress the importance of critically evaluating the message you're sending through a creative work. Especially in video games where different systems and mechanics overlap and interact, it's surprisingly easy to send a message you never intended to send. And I don't think anyone wants to accidentally advocate for racist pseudoscience. Hey there, you just made it to the end of this video, which might even mean that you liked it. If that's the case, you might even consider helping me game the algorithm by throwing a like or a comment my way, watching one of my other videos, or maybe even subscribing, ?